My name is Alex Ferguson. I work at the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers, one of the supporters, along with our members of Canada 2020. It's my pleasure today to be able to be here and introduce the Honourable Minister Jim Carr for Natural Resources Canada. Most of you know Minister Carr for the leadership he's had for a little while now on Canada's natural resource developments. I will say that all of us know, however, the context and the challenge that Minister Carr and all of us operate in, which really is that ever-increasing global and Canadian expectations for responsible development of our natural resources, and the opportunities that exist as a result of the work we put in this space. Key to our success, I think you'll hear today, is really the innovation agenda that we're moving forward with and the entrepreneurs that are in our sectors. So I'm going to quickly turn it over to Minister Carr, who's going to make a few brief remarks, and then he will moderate a panel on innovation in the resource economy with Alexa Young from Teck Resources, Chris Ragan from EcoFiscal Commission, and Dan Wicklum from COSIA. So please welcome Minister Jim Carr to the podium. Thank you, Jim.
Good to see you again. There are a lot of reasons why I'm very happy to be here, but maybe the most important one is that I get to ask the questions. And I'm going to go right from here, and I apologize in advance having to do that right at noon, to question period, when it'll be a little bit different. The tone and tenor of the audience not quite the same. And I also remember the last time I was on a Canada 2020 stage, it was to have the pleasure of interviewing Dan Yergin, whom you all know is the founder of CERAWeek in Houston and one of the finest thinkers in the world today on energy and transformations within the energy economy. So I thank Canada 2020 not only for that, but also for how much it has contributed through its publications, through the facilitation of conversations about this very important subject. When I was listening to Dr. Don, trying to comprehend the complexities of the formula, not my forte. I'm way better when I have an oboe in my hands. But I did think of what it was like to drive a Tesla. And I actually had the pleasure of doing that with Minister McKenna. We were in a car, a Tesla, crossing parts of Alberta, and it was so important that I actually drive the thing. So I put it down to the floor, and it was a rocket ship, and a rocket ship with no sound. But the sound that I did hear was when I spoke to the dashboard and said, "Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, please." And 5 seconds later, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony was playing in this quiet car. And I was so overwhelmed by the technology and the potential that I was even more curious to hear about storage, about the potential of this technology. And I truly believe that we are on the cutting edge of something very, very exciting. I have had the pleasure of representing Canada in 3 countries since I was appointed Minister of Natural Resources. By the way, our first anniversary is on Friday. Believe it or not, it's been a year since the Trudeau government was installed. It's remarkable how much has happened, both personally and politically, in that time. But what I found when I was in Paris representing Canada at the International Energy Association meeting, and then in Katakyushu, Japan, representing Canada at the G7 Energy Ministerial, and then again in India to visit with ministers leading a delegation in the private sector to look at opportunities for Canada and India, was how similar the conversation was, and how similar the conversation is wherever you would want to visit internationally now. The language, the urgency is felt wherever you go. And Canada is right at the cutting edge of all of this opportunity. And it's remarkable, too, how the lexicon has changed within corporate boardrooms and within the natural resource sector. I was meeting with the board of directors of the Forest Industry Association of Canada, and I looked around the room that morning and I just wanted to ask a question out of instinct. So who has been on this board the longest? And a good-looking but elderly gentleman put up his hand and said, "It's me. I've been on the board since 2004. And I said, "Well, how has the agenda changed?" And he said, "It's a different world." So if the world has changed as dramatically as it has from 2004, what will the world look like in 2026 or in 2036? And that is the challenge of government, of academe, of the private sector, to anticipate what these changes are, as imperfect as we know we will have to be by definition. But to put ourselves in a position to make the transition from the old energy economy to the new. And that's where the Government of Canada is at this very moment. The Prime Minister has been quoted many times saying there's no contradiction between building a wind turbine and a pipeline. But the questions about the way in which fossil fuels come out of the ground, the importance of innovation in the natural resource sector is right at the heart of decisions that the government is making right now. People forget, and I know Dan Wicklum is here, and he'll be up on the stage just in a few minutes, that innovation was at the heart of developing the oil sands in the first place. And innovation will be at the heart of extracting conventional sources of energy more sustainably in the second place. And all the while we look to capture trillions of dollars of investment worldwide to show confidence and faith in Canada's capacity and creativity to innovate. And I am full of confidence that we will be competitive and we will do well in spite of all of the challenges that face us. But you really don't want to hear from me. You want to hear from the panelists that I will have the pleasure of moderating. And I would welcome them to come up now. They are Chris Ragan. We actually have a family connection. I won't go into that, but anyone who has a Winnipeg root, I believe, is related to me. If not directly, then indirectly. And we know that Chris wrestles every day with the big questions of reducing greenhouse gas emissions in Canada in the most cost-effective and efficient way. Dan Wicklum, with whom I've met many times, good to see Dan again, who leads an extraordinary group of companies that have put aside their own competitive interests to share technologies that benefit all of them and all of us. And Alexa Young, whose company is a leader in environmental protection, corporate social responsibilities, and Indigenous issues. I'm keen to hear from all of them, as I know you are, so I'm just going to take my seat as the moderator and the one who asks the questions, and we'll get started. So I think I'll start, after having welcomed you all, by asking a generic question that you should all feel free to answer, and then I'll follow up with some individual questions as we move along. So give us a state of play. Where are we at in Canada in this transition from conventional to renewable sources of energy? Position us. Dan, why don't you start?
Thanks, Minister. And you said in your opening remarks that you were welcoming the change of role where you actually have to ask the question, not answer it. And we're obviously now on the answering side. So I'm going to actually pretend I'm a federal minister for a moment and reframe the question in a way that's easier to ask. Okay?
And answer.
To answer, excuse me. Yeah. Yes, right. No, I'll do that. So I'll situate it. I mean, when we talk about sort of where is natural resources on this transition to a cleaner energy future and a lower emission future, I mean, you can't really even begin to answer that question without talking about innovation. So to me, a proxy for your question really is about what is the state of innovation. Okay. And if you strip that assumption back even a little bit further, the state of innovation in the natural resource sector, it's almost impossible to think about that without giving context about how you think about innovation. And usually when we think about innovation, we have a tendency to spring to apps and smartphones and battery cells. So what I'd like to do is just talk very briefly about the context in which resource companies, and I'll use oil sands companies because that's the sector that I work in, the context within these companies find themselves and the strategic drivers of their business, because that dictates the innovation strategy any sector takes, the strategic context of your business. And I come back to three things. One is the scale. So our projects are routinely $5, $6, $7 billion projects. So if anyone's managing that type of budget, it leads you to take a certain strategic approach, whether it's for your business or for your innovation strategy. And I would argue that with that amount of money at play, you take a very deliberate approach. Some could say conservative, deliberate. The pace from idea, conception, to actually building the project can often take 5, 6, 7 years because of engineering and especially regulatory approvals. So that's the pace of innovation, sort of the cycle of a single generation of technology in our sector. Very different than the weeks that might take to make an app, and maybe hundreds or thousands of dollars for an app. We're talking about years and many billions of dollars. And the third strategic context, I think, is the price environment. Many people think of innovation as a company developing a product or service, filling an yet unrealized niche and being able to essentially demand whatever the market would bear in terms of price. That's not natural resources. I mean, all these companies essentially sell into a market price that is globally set. And that also dictates how you run your businesses and how you run your innovation strategy, because you inherently are in a cost reduction strategy as well. So price, scale, and pace sort of is the context, things that set the context for innovation inside of the natural resource sector, very different than things like apps and handsets. Having said all that, I think innovation is extremely healthy in the natural resource sector. I'll just speak about our organization. It's 13 oil sands companies that frankly are redefining how large corporates interact and collaborate globally. We don't know of another model like it in the world. Fundamentally to our model is that these large companies give each other free use rights to their proprietary technology. 4 years ago, before we were launched, the companies were cutthroat competitors. There was duplication, overlap, inefficiencies in technology development. Now they've de facto, through a series of legal structures in full compliance with competition law, have effectively opened their technology kimonos, shown each other their research program, aligned, coordinated, and now are not only sharing technologies together or developing together, but they're sharing them, give each other use rights. And that is a model that, again, we don't know anywhere in the world where this collaboration has been driven this deep and this real. And one quick proof point, in essentially the 3.5 years since we've been fully operational, we have gone a line of sight from setting a priority, jointly developing a technology, sharing the use rights, implementing it, and then realizing an environmental outcome on the ground. And our first proof point is a decrease in freshwater use intensity of 38% in that essentially 3.5 to 4 year timeline. So it's collaboration is not just a concept, it actually works. And I think the resource companies are on the cutting edge of understanding how to push the boundaries of what collaboration means.
Thank you. Chris, go ahead. What's your state of the innovation scene in Canada?
Where we are. Well, your question was about where we are in the transition. So I think we're smack in the middle, maybe closer toward the beginning. But I think the innovation that I would like to talk about, I'm not an expert about innovation, nor am I an expert on the resource sector, so I was an obvious choice for this panel. But as a university professor, that means it doesn't stop me from speaking with authority at great length on either topic. But what I'd like to talk about is the innovation of policy, and I'm going to allude to something that you quoted the Prime Minister as talking about, because I think we need innovation in our thinking and innovation in particular about policy thinking in this country. So let me try to be brief in laying out what I think the problem is. It is still the case in this country and in other countries that there are a set of people who believe that we need to protect the environment in many ways, and that we don't need to worry really about the economic costs. They don't often say those words, but they often behave in that way. And they will talk about the need to place caps on the production of oil, on the need to say no to LNG facilities, in the name of the protection of the environment. And and I think that view is wrong. There's another set of people that take what I think is the equally and opposite, I suppose, extreme view, which is that, you know, we have resources, we need to develop the resources, we get economic value from doing so, and we should not worry too much about the protection of the environment in many dimensions because of the competitiveness risks that it creates for our firms. And I think those people their views are also wrong and overly extreme. And I think what we need is to find that balance. And when a prime minister or a minister stands up and says we can find the balance, maybe people don't believe them. But when an economics professor says it, surely you would believe it. So, and I think this is the crucial part, is that those with the first view are right that we need to protect the environment, but they're not right that we need to do it at the expense of the economy. And the people in the second view are right that we should worry about the competitiveness of our firms and our business sector, absolutely right. But they're not right that all environmental policy challenges that. And at the EcoFiscal Commission, we have been writing reports and advocating the use of what we call eco-fiscal policies, which are to put a price on pollution of various kinds, whether you're talking about residential garbage by the bag or carbon emissions by the ton or anything in between, and recycling those revenues back into the economy. And if you do it right, you can reduce the environmental damage, and if you do it right and you think about it in terms of careful policy design, you can do it in ways that doesn't challenge the competitiveness of your firms, and you can do it in a way that allows you to produce or build an LNG facility and continue building pipelines and continue producing from the oil sands. So I think we've got to find that middle, and it requires people to move away from extreme positions. It requires, I think, a greater understanding of how markets work, and in particular, how pricing works. As economists, we are often accused of knowing the price of everything and the value of nothing. This is a classic way to slag economists. There are many ways. But it is true that we really emphasize the power of pricing, and getting the pricing right, and I'll come back to this in other answers, I think, getting the price right can not only protect the environment and protect the competitiveness of our firms, but it can also drive the innovation that we will need as we continue through this transition.
Alexa, where are we at in the transition?
Well, thank you, Minister. And I wanted to take a step back and thank Canada 2020 for hosting this panel in the first place. It's so incredibly important that we acknowledge the critical role that our traditional resource sectors are going to continue to play in a modern and innovative Canadian economy. And I wanted to take another step back and actually talk about the link between our products and innovation, because we often talk about how our products are essentially the building blocks of virtually everything that we use, from smartphones to the train, planes, and automobiles that got us here today, and the buildings that we live and work in. But we don't talk enough about how these products are also the building blocks of a low-carbon future. So just to put it in perspective, it takes 100 tons of steelmaking coal to produce a single wind turbine. The average electric car takes about 165 pounds of copper wiring. So that's 3 times the amount of copper wiring needed for a conventional vehicle. And we talked a little bit about Tesla today. Tesla is poised in 2030 to account for about 5% of global copper production. So all this to say that our products are going to continue to contribute to innovation, technology, and infrastructure. But as we continue to meet this demand, we know that we need to continue to innovate so that we're continuously improving our environmental and operational performance. And I think we've seen really what some are calling a phase 1 when it comes to innovation in the resource sector. So really concentrating on doing resource development different. So new equipment, new and improved, more environmentally sustainable processing facilities, greater use of innovative water treatment technologies, and even some early conversions to lower emissions technologies that have a relatively rapid payback period. But we're really entering into what I'd like to think is a phase 2 that's really going to be driven by big data. So things like automated vehicles, more precise methods of extraction, and combining low G&G inputs like solar and wind, combined with new fuel sources like LNG at especially remote sites to really drive lower carbon emissions. And I think that collaboration is going to be an essential part of this next phase. So we have COSIA in the oil sands, FP Innovations in the forestry sector, and the mining sector has really changed its way of thinking and has really embraced collaborative approaches in innovation. And this is really manifested in the Canadian Mining Innovation Council, who's looking at advancing a towards zero waste in mining innovation strategy. So really looking at a technological roadmap at how can we reduce waste in key areas. So things like tailings, water use, GHG emissions, and energy consumption. So lots of good work happening and lots still to happen, but I think we're well poised to really position Canada as being a mining global innovation hub.
Dan, you sit around the table with representatives from the largest producing companies in Alberta and from across the country. What is the biggest obstacle between where we're at now and you achieving your goals?
So when I think of obstacles, I actually think of sort of conditions for success. So if you address the obstacles, then you have the condition for success. And a couple come to mind. One is focus. It's very tempting in an innovation agenda, especially for governments, to essentially give access to funds to really smart people and say, hey, come up with good ideas, and if you have good enough ideas, we'll give you some money to develop them. I call that sort of a bottom-up or capacity-driven innovation. There's another way to do it, though, and some of our most successful innovation agendas in history have been much more top-down. There's even a vocabulary around it. We talk about the moonshot in terms of an innovation agenda. And that's really a reference to President Kennedy standing up and saying, look, by the end of the decade, we will put someone on the moon. So I think great change comes when you have the right balance of hope and fear. And we're in a globe now where we really, really want to tackle emissions reductions. And I think collectively our senior leaders, both in industry and the public sector, have the ability to be much more top-down and much more directed in our innovation and say, these are the specific things that we want developed, and then to cut the innovation capacity loose with adequate support to take us to a specific spot that leaders take us. Another way of saying that is focus. Some might say that's choosing winners and losers. I would say it's focus, and what it requires you to do is take a step back and say, as a jurisdiction, whether it's a province or a country, what are inherent advantages that we can capitalize on in order to compete in this global world? We're a relatively small country. There are other countries that will outspend us and have more capacity. So I think our focus is probably both the obstacle and the opportunity. Yeah.
Chris, you talked about marginalizing the extremes and trying to extend the sweet spot in the middle of people who understand that you have to have a balance between environmental stewardship and economic growth. As you look at the trajectory of how that balance moves over time in Canada, what's the pace of change that you think the economy can handle?
Great question. So before I talk about the future, let's just take stock of how the world has changed in the past 10 years on this issue, and in particular on climate policy and carbon pricing. And that has been a policy revolution almost in this country. So 10 years ago, in 2006, there was no jurisdiction in this country that had a significant price on carbon in any significant way. I'm not exactly sure when the ESCR started in Alberta, but it would have been around then where there was a very small price on a small amount of carbon. Today, we have BC with a very well-designed carbon tax in place, Alberta with a tax that is about to go live in a few months. We have Ontario with a cap-and-trade system that will go live in a few months. We have Quebec with a cap-and-trade system that is live. Those two will be linked with California as well. Quebec's already is. Manitoba is currently designing policies and has expressed a commitment to do it. And the federal government has stepped in with a very clear willingness to fill in the policy gaps, let's say to insist that the policy gaps be filled, and if the provinces don't do it, then the federal government stands ready to do so. That is an enormous change in 10 years. Some of those are carbon taxes, some of them are cap and trade systems, but there is broad-based carbon pricing today in roughly 75 to 80% of the economy, roughly 75 to 80% of the emissions, or will be in a few months. That is an enormous change. Now, that carbon price, or those carbon prices, are not yet at the point that will be necessary to, or at the point to be sufficient to reduce emissions to the point we think they need to go to by 2030 or 2050. So those carbon prices, I think, will need to rise, and significantly so. So we have made huge progress in 10 years. It is still a hot topic. It is still a contentious topic. It is more contentious in some parts of the country than in others. But it is emerging as a policy standard. It's not yet as standard as, you know, low inflation, which I also like. It's not as standard as, you know, fiscal responsibility, moderate budget deficits. It's not yet as standard as that, but it's getting there. And I think the interesting thing now to get to the future is as the carbon price spreads across the country and as the carbon price rises, there's going to be some very interesting questions that are raised. And one of the big ones is going to be what are governments, plural, across the country going to do with the carbon pricing revenues? Are they going to give it all back to people? Are they going to give it all back to business? Are they going to devote it to the emissions-intensive sector like the oil sands in Alberta? And what are they going to do to deal with the household impact? What are they going to do to deal with the competitiveness impact in those emissions-intensive sectors? So lots of good questions, but frankly, most of that is a discussion about how to do it, not whether to do it. And that's huge advance.
So Alexa, how about how to do it? And how about the role of government and appropriate incentives that the government should offer the private sector to stimulate the transition?
Well, I certainly think that the national broad-based carbon pricing regime will incentivize emissions reductions over time. It allows for a clear price signal for companies across all of industries to make decisions based on their emissions profiles. So that's a good first step. Certainly, in terms of addressing emissions-intensive and trade-exposed industries, having the provinces embed competitiveness mechanisms will be a critical part of that. But as the government looks to advance its broader innovation agenda, certainly making sure that there is access to funding and programming across the technology readiness spectrum is going to be really important, as we'll be making sure that it's not just for developers, but also adopters. Because certainly a lot of the challenges that we face is not in innovating in the first place, but actually moving to that next phase, so moving to that commercialization and deployment phase. And so looking at some jurisdictions like Australia that have very well-defined, very comprehensive and very well-funded innovation strategies in place that both use a toolkit of tax incentives as well as funding incentives that are driving real results will be important jurisdictions to look at because they are our main competitors and have solid innovation regimes in place.
Dan, you know that Canada is one of the signatories to Mission Innovation that was signed at COP21 in Paris. Prime Minister Trudeau and 19 other heads of state signed it, and that was followed by a commitment among very wealthy people to be part of this initiative, which they saw as the appropriate partnership between the public and the private sectors. You represent the most important private sector players in the oil and gas industry in Canada. How do you see the public-private partnership developing from here on in?
Well, I think just conceptually, the public-private partnership is probably the most important model there's just no other way to do this. This is the only path forward. I mean, if you're going to try to define a problem that was the most intractable problem that's most difficult to solve, you'd come up with emissions. You'd come up with climate change. Doesn't respect borders, long time lag between an emission and an outcome, difficult to link emissions and outcomes. So in some ways, it is the most difficult problem that maybe the human race has ever seen, certainly in recent history. So, and I think it's one of the reasons why our global system of governance has not been able really to come up with a binding way of addressing this. We've made great strides, and our national government has played a fantastic leadership role, but at the end of the day, we're still figuring out how this works. So I think our old systems of governance and our old systems of how we make decisions and focus resources is not terribly well equipped for this. So we have to essentially innovate the innovation process. And this is exactly what's happening with what you're speaking. Private sector leaders are emerging. Individual countries with individual leaders are emerging and saying we have to do things differently. And that is absolutely the future, this concept of collaboration. Most of the people that run the organizations that are in leadership roles now have developed their philosophies through a certain type of a certain career where a competitive philosophy has rewarded them. Now all of a sudden we have to sort of throw that out in a very, very short time frame and realize that we really truly are in this together, and people have to change their personal ways of thinking and their institutional ways of thinking to work together really in a collaborative form compared to a competitive form. So it's exactly the type of initiative that you're talking about that is changing the paradigms of how large organizations interact in a time frame that frankly is most uncomfortable for most people. But I think that's also sort of, again, self-servingly, the philosophy behind the COSIA model, where you have these large corporates that were literally cutthroat competitors for 100 years. Now in the course of a handful of years, they're saying, we're gonna work together because the problems are just too big for each of us to address individually. So that the future is absolutely is collaboration and the governance around collaboration.
Chris, there's also serious competition internationally for literally trillions of investment dollars in the renewable sector and in innovation. How does Canada best position itself to be competitive for those investment dollars?
That's a great question, and I'm not sure I know the answer, but I do think that it's important to think about these opportunities. So quite often when we talk about this transition toward lower carbon economy, lower carbon energy sources, we think of the challenges, and there are many challenges. But we need to also think about the opportunities. And think about the opportunities domestically, but also selling our expertise to the world. So Canada has nuclear expertise. Canada certainly has hydro expertise. And Canada is very quickly developing, you just heard a whole bunch in the previous presentation about battery storage, and we also have solar and tidal power and all kinds of things that are being developed. So we should be mindful of the fact that this is not a transition that's just happening in Canada. We are 2% of a global economy that is making this transition roughly at the same pace. And as the world makes this transition toward lower carbon energy sources and lower carbon everything, there will be massive demands for low carbon expertise, and we ought to be there providing some of it. Also, we should keep in mind how important a driver of that expertise a carbon price will be. When I speak to clean tech venture capitalists, for example, and you say, what's the number one thing that would drive the business model in the clean tech sector? Their answer is a carbon price. You put a carbon price in place, or for that matter, a price of any pollution that we're talking about, but if we're talking about a low carbon things and low carbon technology, you put a carbon price in place and have that carbon price rise over time, and that will drive a massive shift of demand away from high carbon things and toward low carbon everything. And that means all the sort of clean tech technologies, clean tech investments, clean tech ideas just get a huge boost economically. And just keep that in mind, because that will drive those opportunities. And again, whether they're domestically in Canada or whether they're external.
So Alexa, do you think that energy efficiency and technological innovation will be enough to meet future demand of clean energy?
Well, I think, I mean, clearly the world is already transitioning to a low-carbon future, but that's happening at the same time as there remains significant demand for energy overall, and the transition's going to take decades. The International Energy Agency, which is really the seminal organization that collects data and analyzes the transition, has predictions, and it's largely based around the historic shift that we're seeing in places like China and India and elsewhere in Asia towards growing middle classes. And all of the predictions show that the need for conventional energy is going to last for several decades. But at the same time, renewables will accelerate alongside of that. And so certainly over the next several decades, we'll need to see an energy mix that works to meet that demand. But innovation will play a role in ensuring that conventional energy sources is done more sustainably.
Believe it or not, the time has flown. We have 2 minutes left, so we're going to move to the short snapper. And the short snapper is, what is the most important thing in policy innovation or an incentive that the Government of Canada can do to stimulate a quicker pace of transition? Dan, a free shot at the government.
Enabling policy,
Yeah.
sufficient resources, and focus. We will not be able to compete with every country because they will outspend us and they have more capacity, but we do have inherent advantages in this country, especially our natural resources. If we focus on natural resources, we can be successful. If we don't, we will probably get outcompeted.
Chris.
Make a clear commitment beyond 2022 to have the national minimum carbon price rise to the vicinity of $100 plus per ton. A clear commitment to do that, and then you just watch the clean tech and the transition happen.
Alexa.
I would say a well-defined strategy that really aligns itself with the priorities that we're seeking across industries. But it has to be well-defined because historically it's been somewhat fragmented.
Well, I appreciate the advice. And it'll come as no surprise to you that I get advice from all over the place. No, I'm sorry, there is no provision, I'm told,
Well,
for that. But
Minister,
maybe after I leave. So I'm going to
Yes, that's what we'll do.
turn it back to Susan, and thank you all for your attention and the chance to participate in this very rich conversation. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Minister Carr. Thanks very much, Minister Carr. We know you've got to go, sir, but we will keep our panelists up on stage for a couple more minutes to ask a few questions if people have got them, and then we'll have some lunch. So there are 2 microphones as they were before. So we'll maybe pull the lights up a little bit so we have a chance to see some folks. And if I could ask you to identify yourself and keep it to a question, because question period starts at 2:15, not in here. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, my name is Chaitanya Kalevar, Chai for short, and I am from planet Earth. And my question to the minister who is walking away and to the panel is, it's good to talk about the carbon pricing, and it's important, but when are we going to cut out the subsidies to the carbon industries? And why none of the panelists discuss the subsidies to carbon industries?
Does anybody want to tackle that, Chris? Go ahead.
I think it's a good suggestion. Just a couple of quick points. There is a pretty legitimate debate in this country about the nature and the magnitude of what you might call a subsidy to the fossil fuel sector. For the most part, we have no outright subsidies to my knowledge. What we do have are some tax preferences, what you might call tax preferences, and actually it's fairly complicated. So a fair amount of debate about how big they are, and in fact the federal government has acted in the 2008, 9, and 10 budgets to reduce these, and I'm all in favor of those being reduced to zero.
Dan or Alexa, any comment on the benefits, perhaps, of the benefits to the industry from an R&D perspective or an innovation perspective on the sector? Dan?
Well, I mean, I'll talk a purely innovation lens, and there are no preferential treatments to natural resource sectors or the oil and gas sectors in terms of innovation subsidies. We have an SR&D tax credit that's available to any sector in Canada. Now, the natural resource sector and oil and gas sector do definitely take advantage of that, but so do other sectors. So I'm not aware of any preferential treatment for natural resources or the oil and gas sector in terms of a subsidy, in terms of an innovation lens. Yeah.
Thanks, Dan. Question over here?
Hi, my name is Devashish Paul. I have a question related to convergence of technology and the natural resources sector. So I'll use a couple of examples. For example, Rio Tinto is deploying self-driving mining vehicles globally in the mines that they operate. Over in the Houston, Texas oil patch, the computing industry is actively working with the oil and gas industry to deploy like graphics processing and other high forms of multi-core processing close to the operations where the natural resources are extracted. And it seems to me that this is an area where kind of the two sectors in Canada haven't adequately converged, and it presents an opportunity to basically provide a differentiation for our whole nation in terms of international competitiveness, not so much what comes out of the ground, but how do we monetize the ability to get the stuff out of the ground and export that capability globally. And I can use an example from 1975. My dad's company, US Steel Canada, which was known as Metchem Canada Inc., got a $500 million contract in India to develop India's largest iron ore mine because they didn't have the technology in India, but we had it from northern Quebec. And we won, as Canadians, we won that contract. And deploying a mix of Canadian and US technology.
Thanks. So how do we better deploy? Your companies are doing innovative things. We know companies are doing innovative things in the sector. Are we doing the best that we can to export that technology to Canada's benefit? Alexa, you talked about some innovative things that Teck's doing.
I think once we're entering into this next phase that I'm talking about, I think we will see that more. We've historically, as the mining sector, done a lot of the work on innovation in a very siloed way. And I think where we're going to see big advances in terms of what this question was about is as we continue to collaborate, there's momentum that happens behind that so that we can be seen globally as a mining innovation hub and then get more FDI from international technology companies investing in Canadian innovation. So I think it's going to be a bit of a cyclical next phase when it comes to being able to export Canadian innovation technology abroad.
Right, thanks. Dan, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I mean, often these things decay into a definition. What does technology development mean? What does collaboration mean? But at the end of the day, when we're talking about technology, there is a very logical stream of actions that happen. There's an idea, there's develop, there's demonstrate, there's deploy, there's implement, and the process of collaboration and innovation can actually be managed very well. And if you strip it right back to the first principles, it's really about getting smart people in the room that have a diversity of backgrounds, diversity of experiences, diversity of skills to think about things in a way that hasn't been thought about before. Mm-hmm. So I think every one of the natural resource sectors has some type of model where they're forcing these collisions between different people and institutions in new ways. So we have one, for example, where we have a very, very strategic relationship with the country of Israel. They're a global leader in water treatment technologies. We have water treatment needs. So we have a steady stream of ideas and technologies coming from Israel to be tested in Canada. But just by nature of that relationship, they understand what you have as well. And now we're seeing just the beginning of the steady stream of ideas and, frankly, business opportunities being streamed from Canada to Israel. So when we talk about this opportunity, it all comes down to relationships, and relationships are essentially have to be managed very, very deliberately, which brings me back to this notion of the need for new governance models to force collisions and ideas together in ways that they wouldn't have otherwise, in a deliberate way and in a focused way.
I think you can also leverage mechanisms that we've got when you talk about our trade relationships and exploiting that through NSERC and things like that, getting those collaborations to go and telling the story a whole lot better. I don't think we do a good job as Canadians in telling our story and getting the word out. But I think organizations like yours are doing a great job at that. Last question before lunch.
Hi, my name is Mike Blusky. I'm actually a Master's of Political Management student at Carleton University. I also happen to be the 5th generation of my family to work for the same mining company back home in Sudbury.
Awesome.
And my question deals specifically with, the human resources part of mining here in Canada. We've definitely come a long way in the past century. We no longer use timber beams to support mines. Even, taking a look at the past 50 years, where there were stories of McIntyre powder being used in order to, quote unquote, protect employees in Timmins. And we are finding that occupational health and safety has taken a much more important role. But with that has also come, further changes in terms of environmental concerns, how that's going to affect the mining industry, and also the employment situation. Layoffs have been very common in certain parts of natural resources, and what I'm really trying to get at is how do you see the employment aspect of natural resources moving forward in such a fast-changing economy, so that way we can make sure that companies are not only providing safe employment for people, but also employment that is attractive to employees and that sort of thing.
Thank you. Alexa, do you want to tackle that first?
Well, we've certainly seen a significant shift in the safety culture of mining over its 100 years experience. I mean, at Teck, for instance, we have a very robust safety program that's really about making sure that every employee goes home safe and healthy every day. And whether you work on a mine or work in an office, it's really about ingraining a sense of how you are personally responsible for safety day to day. And so there's lots of good programs in place on tops of different ways that safety has been engineered into the sector over the years. But certainly in terms of making jobs attractive, there's still a significant need in mining given the significant demographic shift we're seeing. There's an enormous amount of retirements happening over the next few years. And so in terms of skilled trades, those are still very much high in demand. And in terms of what we're talking about today with the innovation activities that we have underway and some of that clean tech supply chain spin-off we're going to see come out of that, there's significant opportunity for mining to continue to contribute to jobs and innovation in the clean tech space, which is, I think, what you were trying to get at there.
Great, thank you. Any person on the way?
I think, let me begin with, I think, the case for optimism. I think we should all be optimistic, whether we are in the natural resource sector or not. We should be optimistic about the future of Canada's resource sector, because we are blessed with a wonderful endowment of resources that the world wants, whether they are base metals or fresh water or forests or oil or natural gas. We are blessed with these wonderful resources. And so, it would be shocking to me if we didn't continue developing them. But there's the need to do it in an environmentally responsible way, and in a way that treats your workers very well, not just treats them well, but gives them good jobs. And government and businesses will be working together and should be working together in terms of developing the kinds of labor standards and environmental standards that are appropriate for both developing the resource and for doing it in a responsible way.
Great, thanks. Final word to you, Dan.
I'll just pick up on a common thread here. Your question was really around people. What's the future of people in the resource sector? And again, I'll link it back to the theme of the panel, which is innovation. And again, innovation really just is about smart people having a spark of a good idea inside of a system and being able to run with it, right? So I think the natural resource companies, they know the strength is their people. So treating them well is not just a good business opportunity, it's putting them in the right mental space to change and to adapt and to innovate and to be fresh. So I'm really picking up on Chris's notion that the future absolutely is bright. I'll just tell you really quick about one project that we have going that the employees of our oil sands companies just really grab hold to and push. It's called our X Prize. So we're funding $20 million to the team in the world, anyone in the world, that can best take carbon, which is right now it's a liability, it's a greenhouse gas. We're giving $20 million to the team that can best take carbon and change it into a valuable resource. So we're completely reimagining carbon. Boy, you get that type of project, innovation project prize, and communicate it to the young people around the world in resource sectors, boy, they just grab onto that and they identify with that as much as they would with Tesla or lithium-ion batteries. So, the natural resource sector companies are not just doing better things for their companies and for Alberta, they're moving into the solution space actually for all of these challenges globally. So the future actually is very bright for these natural resource companies.
Right. Thank you. Thank you, Alexa. Thank you, Chris. Thank you, Dan. I'd like to end on a note of optimism. It was a great panel. Thanks very much.